Many people regard you as a personification of Ubuntu. What do you understand Ubuntu to be?
In the old days when we were young, a traveler through a country would stop at a village and he didn't have to ask for food or for water. Once he stops, the people give him food, entertain him. That is one aspect of Ubuntu, but it will have various aspects. Ubuntu does not mean that people should not enrich themselves. The question, therefore, is, are you going to do so in order to enable the community around you to be able to improve? These are the important things in life. And if one can do that, you have done something very important which will be appreciated.
On the 13th of January 2019, the open source report from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. The open source report has been a fixture around here for a number of years that we've presented in one form or in the other over actually 20 years. We went back. We had it for a number of years over at Blog Talk, and then we went over to Speaker, and now we are on iHeart. And of course, you can always find us on the RSS feed. We've been there, and you can find us on Twitter, on YouTube, an audio edition there. We're going to a video edition as we move along here for 2019. In this episode, we will be examining the state of open source 2019, the Linux kernel, where it is going, the economic condition or the economics of open source, the potential conflicts between our libertarian friends in the open source movement and where library software is going, and a number of other things as things get more quote-unquote corporate friendly. It's sort of analogous to the neoliberal trends in the broader body politic, which are lapsing over, obviously, or have lapsed over to software and how software is done. For a number of years, in the early 2000s, 2001, 1999, we went about the country at various User Blue conferences talking about open source. At the time, it was Linux and the potential of the Linux kernel and of the Free Software Foundation, the general license there, which we have been a part of since the 80s. We at Cranston Software believe in library software and in library hardware, open source hardware, open source software. Now, it's obviously dependent upon the license, dependent upon the parties in each project. When we started, an example, the Apache project, it was the Apache server. And the number one person that pushed it, HTTP server, was IBM. And Apache, we registered there, and we still get the newsletter from the Apache server. You don't hear as much about it now, but we use it, although we use WordPress. We have an Apache server. We'll be doing more with this. One of the things for us at Cranston Software, we will be more involved in the software development in 2019 as we move towards a 2020 presidential year. One of the things we do here is modeling. We do our own modeling. We write our own models as part of Cranston Software, Cranston Analytics. The same thing we do in the Economics Analytics Division, which used to be at one time called what did we call ourselves at that time? We were been so long ago since we changed analytics, but at that excuse me, at that time it all revolved around a model very similar to economics .com, which was an econometrics is one of the econometrics is still there. It's one more and more to modeling. What has happened is from the Boston Red side, another side of the Boston Red Network, WBRN Radio, is the political science, the cephalogical side, dealing with cephalogy, and we're dealing with various types of modeling there, and all of this has started to intersect. Going back to the political neoliberal model, which is in government, you have a government-private model that's now in the shutdown, and we offer our support to the almost 1,800,000+ government workers that are locked out of their workplaces from Ogden, Utah to Washington, D.C., to Maryland, to West Virginia, across to the FAA training center in Oklahoma City, and various other places. And there are software developers that are locked out, federal workers, and there are also so-called private contractors. And the private contractors are getting paid zero. And to remember that. And that affects developers. As we look at the lines become a little bit more blurred, since we have so-called cloud computing now, and software as a service, hardware as a service, etc. We'll get into some of that in the broadcast, because it is, as they say, an eventuality that we talk about these and talk about some of the philosophical ideas behind it. Back to the Use of Blue conferences, we talked about a different kind of approach, a socialist type approach to software development. And Mr. Hoyle, I think was his name now, I have to get his essays out and bring it into an open source report. Let me move here to a different screen, quite literally, since we're not visual here. The current kernel, we always start out with it. This is a stable kernel. It is 4.20.2 is the stable kernel. The release candidate is 5.0. Much is being talked about the release candidate. As many that are familiar with the kernel, a lot of the kernel includes drivers, etc. We'll be talking about that as we move along here. I believe we're up to 4.91 point. I'm not certain. In the Slackware kernel, which we use on our major server here, we started experimenting. At one time, we used an Ubuntu server. Now we're using one of those as a media server, and the reason behind that is there are a number of programs that for the drivers, and these drivers were developed for the Windows system, don't work as well on open source. But once again, we find that Ubuntu has a few issues. One of the things we do like about it is the Nomi server that is there, the Nomi edition that is there. We've never really been that, as they say, in love with the Katie development as far as their server, going back to the original X servers, and we like those. But we'll be reporting more on this. But as far as stability, yeah, the stability is there for the Ubuntu server there. It's one of their latest ones, but it's not a Slackware server. We'll look at some other additions also as they say, we move merely along. Let me start out with a Microsoft story. And we saw this on one of our workstations This is an update of the 10th of January 2019. An update that literally destroyed some Windows 7 devices. They released 2 software updates that rendered some Windows 7 based machines useless. We don't update. We have one around we use occasionally. But we did have a Windows 8 machine that the same thing happened to it. The problem sprang from the implementation of January the 8th of a security-only update. That's in the monthly roundup. That is KB4480970. 2 of the more recent updates introduced the new protections against spectrum and meltdown, and we covered that in a broadcast, and fixed a session isolation bug affecting a PowerShell, for those that use PowerShell. But nonetheless, what the problem there was, it updated the activation and validation component found in the Windows activation technology, which helps users confirm they are running a genuine versions of the particular system. But the problem was one administrator on Reddit woke up one morning and found a few thousand Windows 7 machines that are still out there. Reported it wasn't genuine. The system admin's original post said after much troubleshooting, we found that KB 971033 should not have been installed on the KMS environment, the KMS server. Until today, having this KB installed hadn't been an issue. It appeared to change when the Microsoft activation server responded. Now, the KSM stands for the Microsoft Key Management Server. Many corporations use that to automatically activate volume licenses, additions in it and Office. So that issue is being looked at. It also affects some of the Windows 8 servers, workstations around. We had one of those that got affected by it, but anyway, it was solved. After installing the update, some users are reporting the activation error not genuine. So if you see that, you now know what it is, and you know to get rid of that server. Anyway, removing the update, deleting the KMS cache, and activation date for the PCs, and reactivating against the agent. Evidently, that is the fix. So we thought we'd put that in. From AMD, incidentally, there is a new CPU out, Ryzen. We'll talk about Ryzen and where Ryzen is going. For many people, we've been in AMD house for over 20 years, since the 1990s. You call it that time. There was an Intel dealers program, and many people feared by going to AMD they would lose the right to sell Intel processors. We have, in the past, we don't sell them anymore, but we did sell some, very few, Intel CPUs as part of the systems we were building. We also sold from the beginning. It's kind of interesting. If you go back to some of the first PCs, you actually saw processors from AMD in some of the early PCs in the mid-'80s. And I'm thinking with a bit of joy, I was watching on YouTube, the Cyrex processors, we also sold those. They were faster than Intel's and AMD's K, whatever it was at the time. But the AMD was always noted for graphics, and we messed around with graphics. We had our web servers, and they were very good for web servers. Some people he talked about in terms of code compatibility, some of the developers, and it was factually correct, but some of the code, particularly some of the Windows stuff, was written more for the Intel type processors, our servers. We dealt with both. We dealt with the AMD workstations. Not too many AMD laptops, but we did have that. And coach with Opteron, that's the server processor. They are as fast as, well, I need to clean this up a little bit. one of LBJ's favorite sayings. Anyway, this is from TechCrunch. The open source software took over the world. That was it was just 5 years ago. There was an ample dose of skepticism from investors about the viability of open source as a business model. This is incidentally by Mike Volpe, I suppose how he pronounces his name. Anyway, the common thesis was Red Hat was a snowflake and had no other open source company would be significant in the software universe. Red Hat, of course, is being acquired, and this is more back to this quasi open source substitute public private type of thing. And in this sense, it's a corporate open sourcey thing that at $32 billion and 3 times its market cap for 214. MuleSoft was acquired after going public for $6.5 billion. MongoDB is now worth north of $4 billion, and some of the other companies here, Elastic, PEO now values the company at $6 billion. So a lot of these open source companies, and they tend to be how open source they are and how they manage, and a merger between Cloudera and Hortonworks. We've worked with both of those companies in the past. They have now a cap north of $4 billion in addition to growing clout there. And basically what they both offer is a management tools for the what is the server? Slow on early Sunday morning here, but nonetheless, some of the products there, Hortonworks, let me just take a quick look here at this merger. Cloudera, the merger, oops, it was a $5.2 billion this is a high-flying the Hadoop high-flying platform there. We have it up. You can download it. 2 companies announced their merger in a deal of $5.2 billion based on the price of close of business, where companies like Hortonworks and Cloudera came in. The package for IT departments wanted the advantage of a big data processing. Incidentally, Bloomberg uses the platform, and many others use it also. And this is a management tool on the enterprise model there. Combination companies have 2,500 customers and $720 million in revenues, and $500 million or $500 million in cash with no debt, according to the companies. Cloudera was founded in 2008, raised over $1 billion before going public. The vast majority coming in one major from Intel Capital in 2014. Hortonworks, founded 3 years later, raised $248 million, not to be left at. These companies, of course, are moving, as one would say, right along. And the picture here, interesting, under the commercial common license here from these Spark services and similar for Google services, etc. here. Multi-cloud capable services, etc. here with HUDAP and the alike. Anyway, let me go back over here. I always have to look. It's kind of interesting. It flew very, very high, and of course, now with containers and there's some other things out there that blend into this, but the market slowed and the two companies announced. So that was part of the market. Facebook and some others use the Hadoop, and I'm not sure why I mispronounced it. The Hadoop technology is what we were. Anyway, let me fly on back here. These are the two with Hadoop technology. Not flying as much. The containers have something to do with it. And from open source to open core to software as a service were not really businesses. They were revolutions against unfair profits that closed, and this is from TechCrunch here, that closed companies reaping it. And they mention, of course, people like SAP, Oracle, and Microsoft were extracting a monopoly like rents for software when the top developers of the time didn't believe it was world class. So beginning with the most broad use of components, operating systems, databases, etc., progressive developers collaborated on offered asymmetrically to offers at great pieces of software. And they mentioned MySQL. Incidentally, MySQL was bought by Oracle. Now, there are two editions of MySQL, the open, or the free one, but it has been forked, MySQL that is, and I was just looking at it, and I'm not sure why he did it this way, but anyway, it's sometimes that article is not written correctly here. Anyway, it's Mongo DB. It was a fork from MySQL. Very successful. Period. And onto these Gen 1 and Gen 2 open source companies evolved their project. First, the open source software is now largely developed within, and this is a big problem. And we talked about this in, I believe, the last two broadcasts that we made, and because of the over influence of these people, people like old Linus Torvalds and company, they all work for Red Hat or for whomever, and the so-called open source foundation is actually a corporate front. Will this continue? Well, we'll see how this all turns out. And then there's Gen 3. Gen 3 is a number. Companies are definitely more tightly controlled by the host companies. The open source community still plays a pivotal role, not much of one. And the whole idea of GitHub being sold to Microsoft. So in other words, you're seeing this in the corporate world also, but corporations are getting bigger and bigger. It's the big fish takes on the minnow, the guppy, and devours him. So you're seeing a lot of this devoured, period. The community also acts as a QA department for open source software. Well, anyway, GitHub's comments, threads, and Hacker News, features is not a product. Community also ends up effectively being the project manager for these projects. It asks for enhancements and improvements. It points out the shortcomings. And oh boy. Anyway, at least he's honest here what's going on. What has changed is that the community is not as involved as it used to be in the actual coding. And this is a very negative development. While that is a drawback relative to Gen 1, Gen 2 companies, it's also an invincible reality of an evolving business model. A pro-business model, the rise of the developer. It's important to realize increasing importance of developers for these open source projects. Additional go-to-market model, closed source software targeted IT as a purchasing center, while IT still plays a role. The real customers open source are developers who often develop the software, then download and integrate it into prototype versions of the project. Once infected by open source, these projects work their way through development circles. And this is one of the things that's happened. Developers in the enterprise now work on, particularly in the cloud, work on open source type projects, and they are familiar with them. Now, one would posture here that eventually they will come to understand that the open source software itself has a potential to be truly open once again. In other words, open source, and I'm back to the writer here, software permeates itself through the true experts and makes of the selection process much more grassroots than it has been historically. Developers basically vote on their feet, and this is in stark contrast to how software had traditionally been sold. No doubt about that. Fundamentally, the software is never sold. It's adopted by developers who appreciate software more because they see it, use it themselves, rather than being subject to it based on executive order. Well, that has also changed within IT departments, that much of the hardware in IT departments is quote-unquote consumer grade, and this is when you have mobile phones and various other things coming into not IT departments but into the corporate culture. So the whole corporate culture has changed in that much of the heavy lifting is now done, and used to be done with the office suites. It's now done via the email, text messages, etc., and the IT departments manage that. Today, even today, customers do not have the same level of resistance to paying high prices per unit for software that is theoretically free, but even through, let me back to my page here, even through open source software is a low cost per unit. It makes up the total market size by leveraging the elasticity in the market. When something is cheaper, most people buy it. That's why open source companies have such massive and rapid adaptation of their lines of business. Another great advantage of open source companies is they're far more efficient, virtual go-to-market motion. The first and most obvious benefit is a user is already a customer even before she pays for it, because so much of the initial adaptation of open source software comes from developers organically downloading and using the software. A proof of concept, they usually already use 500 instances of our software in your environment. Account executives to system engineers ratio can go from sales qualified leads to close sales within a quarter. Virtually allowed for open source businesses to be far more efficient than traditional software businesses from a cash consumption basis. Some of the best open source companies have been able to grow their businesses at triple digit rates well into their life while maintaining a moderate burn rate of cash. In other words, it's cheaper to run on that. From open source to freedom is worth elaborating. The general movement from true open source to community assisted freedom. As mentioned above, the early open source projects labeled community as a key contribution to the base, in addition to a slight elements of community licensed software. There was significant pushback from the community. These days, the community and the customer base are more knowledgeable about the open source business model, and the open source companies deserve to have a paywall so that they can contribute both to build and innovate. In fact, customers' perspective to points here, and they named some: elastic and cockroach labs. Well, I saw them there. But in the development economics, where much of the rent exists anyway, it is unlikely that enterprise companies would elect the copycat as a supplier. A key enabler in the movement has been more modern software licensing that companies have either originally embraced or migrated to over time. Mongo's new license, as well as Elastic and Cockroach, are good examples, unlike Apache's incubator license, which was often the start for open source projects a decade ago. These licenses are far more business friendly, and we don't like them. Most models, software business models, are adopting them. Open source business models are adopting them. Now, this is a new kind of license, and it's moved to much more right wing. The Future pinned this article on open source, the iconic thing. This has been going on. If the Fortune, 5,000 migrate their speed on closed open source to open source, it will we will see an emergence of a whole new landscape of software companies with leaders in the core value of tens of millions of dollars. Clearly, that day is not tomorrow. Anyway, this is the article here in TechCrunch by Mike Volpe. Yeah, let me move on here. This is from opensource.com. 5 open source resolutions for 2019. Password managers. Over a year ago, I moved all my passwords over to a password manager. I use an open source password manager, and I plan to start encouraging everyone to do so. Evangelize password managers. I seem to see that also. Password managers are simple to use. They will generate strong passwords from a variety of set rules and can be used across devices. So in the coming year, I encourage everyone to go. And this is by Mark Brussel. He's a Red Hat community moderator. File more bug reports on my blogs and articles these days. I didn't write as much code, which means one of the obvious ways of contributing to an open source project is really an option. What can I do, however, is file more bug reports. Encourage more people to volunteer, and not specifically for open source projects. I'm guessing many of these people who read this site are already involved in open source projects, and we hope so too. At least if you are not giving code, you can do as we are doing, propagandizing here. Look after my emotional and mental health. Okay, well, that's good too. Point people to opensource.com. It's shocking to see. Just recently, I was talking to someone about the struggle with decision making and transparency in their organization. I said, do you know about opensource.com? There's lots of information on open source the world. Anyway, this is Mr. Mike Brussel. Here he's an open source advocate since 1979. He is employed as a chief security architect for Red Hat. All right. There we go. Now, to Computer World. This is UK open source technology trends in 2019. Containers. We talked a little bit about containers. The Microsoft CFO, Amy Hood, candidly explained that the company's GitHub purchase was as much about giving Microsoft access to a community as it was about technology. One of the key themes coming out of the major open source companies this year has been the notion of open source infrastructure, creating collaborative models that could function as a base for businesses to develop plural on top of much like the digital economy relates to the internet. We expect to continue in 2019 alongside development with containers, and this is one of the things we talked about, containers to move to microservices, open technology like containers, Docker and Kubernetes, in particular, are helping businesses package up their legacy applications and put them on the cloud. Recently, estimates from 451 Research notes that container market even in the early days of the space, suggest enormous growth. Application containers set to become a 2.7 billion market by 2020. Not only is Kubernetes adopting, this is one of the things that affected Hortonworks and Cloudera. In the developers' world, it's also increasingly informing a major enterprise purchase decisions. See investments below as VMware buying Hep2 for $500 million. Anyway, and Amazon Web Services announced that a KVM-based Firecracker in November is offering a lightweight virtualization model for secure, seamless computing, which promises better security without having to trade in performance. The OpenStack's foundation, Mark Caller, notes that 75% of organizations are contributing to as well as consuming open source. He claims there's a growing resentment towards the big free cloud providers amongst open source developers and startups. Many feel that the substantive commercial rewards these large players are reaping don't match up with the upstream contributions from these users. That says Collier. This is reaching a boiling point, but I predict the move to create more restrictive license that is will ultimately fail. Conical's director of products adds that Kubernetes is making a multi-cloud adaptation easy, and instead of the big free will be keep opening up piece by piece. That is from AWS's Firecracker. Other communities will spring up. That is true. It always happens. Composability. Western Digital CEO here, Martin Frank, believes that next year will lead to development of truly open composabilities, where, in short, organizations are able to run, compute, network, and store in the same devices with simplified workload provisioning. Although composabilities is not a new term. In 2019, we see open composabilities versus today's inflexibility. Proprietary services come of age and go to mainstream. That's what Mr. Frank from Western Digital has to say. And let's see. However, warns Carix. He's this person is at the OpenStack Foundation. The extreme composability of software is also coming with security costs. So these are some things. Although GitHub and Red Hat buys were arguably the most talked about acquisitions, the open source space last year, there are other notable purchases and trends. And VMware paid $500 million, $550 billion to Hippo, which the company said would harden upstream Kubernetes. Anyway, Salesforce, meanwhile, completed its acquisition of integration specialist MuleSoft, leading to another interesting partnership down the road between Docker and Salesforce. It allows enterprise customers not only to port legacy applications, that's what it's all about, into a container form, but also to retrieve data from those legacy applications. Let me just to Tech Republic, predictions for 2019 19, purchasing power. If it was one thing, an open source significantly valued in enterprise business. And they mentioned basically the same things here about Red Hat, etc. Believe that the trend is will spill into 219 with SUSE, Apache, Ubuntu via Canonical, Docker, and other enterprise class open source projects. But count on this, the appeal of purchasing open source projects by enterprise level businesses will continue to grow. Policy leads to diversity. Policies lead to diversity for diversity. Ugh. 2018 also saw a rise in open source code of conduct. We watched those, unfortunately. That's a very positive step towards. Was met with some resistance. I think it's safe to say we'll start seeing more policies and procedures pop up with various open source communities. With the kernel group leading the charge, serious positive steps forward will be taken, which will lead to very significant change in the open source landscape. It's called diversity. We talked about diversity, and in fact, we did a workshop on not only diversity, but diversity in development. Very important. Now, you talk about diversity in, say, a Google or Facebook in terms of hiring practices and the looks of the community. But we're also talking about in the development of those communities, sustainable development there. Predict in 2019 we'll see a massive rise in women playing a role in open source development. No doubt about that. Linus Torvalds had to go take his little anger management, of course. Not only will open source development benefit from diversity, but leadership as well, and look to see more women stepping in. But I'd say not only more women, more African Americans and other people of color. Blockchain Linux. I'm not really going out much of a limb here, but I believe 2019 will see the release of Blockchain Pacific Linux distribution. The distribution will contain all the necessary bills for businesses to spin up blockchain-ready servers, and we'll look forward to that period. Installing on the likes of Hyperledger, Fabric, etc. as Linux servers. Linux everywhere. If you thought Linux was prevalent in 18, in 19 Linux will be found in nearly every aspect of technology from end to end, and without claiming will be the year of Linux desktop. I'm not sure, but I think a lot of improvement could go into that. Production of consumer-grade Linux desktops and laptops will start as competition to a Chromebook. Well, Chromebook is kind of interesting. Talk of Chromebook trying to put Windows on it. Anyway, speaking of which, the Linux desktop, I predict that that might surprise everyone. The KDE developers will release a version of their Plaza desktop. It's so jaw-dropping, well, they haven't come with anything yet. However, the KDE Plasma has been slowly improving in the shadows. Not to spot it, well, we hope it does. Linux will drive AL, artificial intelligence, and that's one of the things we look at. Android is fueled by the Linux kernel, because Android will be the single biggest player in AL. And there's some situations here that Android would turn to future, and they would go the Linux kernel. To old Linux, Linus Torvalds there, he claims the world wasn't ready for the 5.0 kernel in 2008. Soon it will be 2.19. It's 2.19 now. And although there would be an award-winning jaw-dropping feature in 5, it would be a much cleaner, more efficient code. We hope so. And the old architecture would have been stripped out with more dedicated bytes. In the end, the Linux kernel will be faster and more reliable. It used to be faster and more reliable. Linux will dominate in the following areas: cloud, the Internet of Things, supercomputing, big data, DevOps, blockchain, serverless computing, and containers. And what did we miss there? Anyway, that is it. And I'll check out time here. Get in the new AMD processor, and we'll close this down. Let me see if I can find it. Somewhere. Now, this is AMD speeded its Rayon 7 GPU, and they're dealing with NVIDIA here. But actually, we wanted to look at the processor. Announced the new Radeon. This is a graphics card. This is $700 more expensive level there. And where graphics is going is running a game at 4K 1440, where the speeds are going. This is from a gaming operation here, and let me see where we. I'm seeing it twice here. And we can get back to AMD here, where we maybe this is ZDNet here. Probably we have it hiding around here somewhere. Just a minute without having to take a break. Well, we'll have to do it like this. The editing will take care of some things. And Alexa, incidentally, is another big vision going on here. And this is not where we were going here. See if we can kind of do a little shortcut here and fly over to the Ryzen processor. We looked at it. It will be a 0.7. Let me see on videos. Here we go. This was at the Consumer Electronic Fair. Here we go. Well, we just do it out of Forbes. We don't usually do things out of Forbes, but we will on this particular. This is the reveals that this is a Ryzen 300 series. It would be 7 nanometer, excuse me, CPU performance faster than the Intel i9-9. This is a new Ryzen desktop processor. Somewhere we have the keynote address. Hopefully we'll find it. Anyway, the benchmark reveals 14%, the multi-thread performed 14% faster. Let me see here. Core for core, the AMD's level with Intel's performance there. This is a different one here, but the new, it'll be out in the second quarter of 2019. This will it will fit on the AMD 4th generation platform. It'll cover new information about 3rd generation Ryzen CPUs. This really is not technical enough here, unfortunately. So kind of this is what happens when you sometimes don't preview things before you grab them up. Anyway, for whatever reason, we're not getting what we are looking for here. And Yeah, we go to the street here, I suppose. I actually had the CEO, Dr. Lisa Soom, Dr. Soom, when she actually presented it in a keynote. AMD had not had a keynote there for a very, very long time. It's a 7 nanometer, if you can believe that one. Bed is now out. The CPU is a different type of CPU. We'll get a picture of it and hopefully put it up there. But some of what is going on here, it'll be his first 7 nanometer CPU aimed at the desktop market. And of course, with it would come the with other markets, let's just say that. Incidentally, AMD does not manufacture chips now. It'll be manufactured at Taiwan. Semiconductors, cutting edge, is a 7 nanometer wafer, it's called. Anyway, they'll be doing some, and they do chips at that particular location for other types of wafers for other companies, I should say. They'll also have notebooks and gamers here, all of this in there as they take on NVIDIA and the various chips involved in NVIDIA. Somewhere on the Cranston Facebook we had Dr. Sood's video up there of her and what was going on there with AMD. We'll see if we can grab up this NVIDIA commercial. I hope you hear it anyway. So we'll get that. This will do it for us. Open source 2019. They're working with that. We'll figure that one out as we move along here and see exactly where we are. And we'll get rid of the whole thing there. We ran a little over an hour, not too bad. We'll see if we can find Dr. Sue's address. It was a very short address. We'll get it out here and impinge it on the bottom. This is AMD. This is AMD. This is MA Crest Software. Have a good week, everyone. We'll talk to you the next cast here. The next cast that we have, I should say, from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network.